Hi, Carla from Portugal.
Hello, Portugal. Sounded like Ricardo.
Hello,
Hello from
Rachel,
Spain.
Raquel from Spain.
More
Hello.
Spain here.
Hello from Spain.
Hello.
Hello from Idaho.
Idaho, fun.
Yes. Hello from Denmark.
Hello, Denmark. How you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Hello from Michigan.
Hello. Also Michigan.
Hello. Minnesota here.
Hello,
from New Orleans,
Minnesota.
Louisiana.
Hello from Minnesota.
Hello. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Carla. Nice to see you and thank you.
Nice to see you here too, dear.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. We'll be getting started in just a minute or two.
You're on.
There's Dr. Paul.
Super. Wonderful. Welcome, welcome.
Hello from UK.
Hello, UK.
Hello from Mexico. Hi, Carla.
Welcome, welcome.
Hello from
Hi, good
Pennsylvania.
morning.
I'm at work.
Okay, that's okay too.
Hello from Sweden.
Hello, Sweden. Nice to see you on here too.
And
The second one from Sweden here.
Another Sweden. Hello, Sweden.
Hello
And
from
I'm calling
California.
you from the middle of nowhere, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. Hi,
Hello,
Stuart.
Professor Clayton. Hello, sir.
Well, we are having fun here just listening to where how many people are calling in from different places. Think we've got pretty much many countries all over the world. So I'm going to say a great welcome to everybody. Welcome, welcome. Glad you're here on this Saturday. And I am going to mute everybody, as we know how it gets to be when people plug in, and it gets a little loud sometimes when people don't get muted here and there. So I am muting everybody. Now, we love to come on our Saturday calls, and they are always working on being educational and inspirational. And mostly because we have such incredible products in Zinzino that we absolutely love, and we see the results from them. We also are excited about the business because we have things that so many people need, and we can prove this with a blood test. And we want to get the word out to everybody. Now, sometimes we get excited to hear from speakers when they're telling us how not only important, but how effective our products are for what is the need out there. And our speaker today, I would say, is the world leading expert in test-based nutrition, in nutrition in general. And not only is he an expert, he has been leading other incredible places and countries on educating them on why it is so important to have the right nutrients in the right balance to get the right optimal function in every area of your body. And so we have him on our call today. Now, when things worked for my son with this, I got excited, as any mother would do. And the first place I went was a conference where our speaker was at, and he was speaking about this, and I waited in line to speak with him just to get the information on why this was working so dramatically for my son. And he just said things so clearly and so obviously that you just trust him. You understand the knowledge he has behind things, but you trust him. And I can tell you, I trust him fully. And I know a lot of the partners that have just heard him for a short period of time, you also trust him fully. And he's going to talk today exactly on that topic of why Zinzino is leading the way and actually is the only way in regards to health in the future, or to make sure this is the way we need to go. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say. I'm excited to have him on here and that he's taking the time, no matter where he is in the world, I never know. So we're gonna find out where he's calling in from. Let's give a fantastic Zinzino welcome to our speaker, Dr. Paul Clayton. Hello, Dr. Paul, from all of us.
Hey, it's good to be here. Where is here? I'm going to show you exactly where I am. If I can find a way to do this. Hold on.
I heard you say it was the middle of nowhere, so now I'm getting excited to see where it is you're going to show us.
Okay, so I'm going to show you the view outside my window. So this should be a full picture.
That
This
is,
is the view outside my window. And it's really the middle of nowhere. I'm in the mountains. Very few traces of civilization. I do have Wi-Fi. And as I've been on tour for quite a few weeks now, I really need a haircut. But the only person around here who cuts hair is actually a sheep farmer who also shears sheep. And having seen his sheep, I think stylistically he's stuck in the 70s. So I have decided not to visit his establishment, and I'm going to wait until I get back to the bright lights in the big city. So I'm going to talk today about why the medical system that we know and perhaps don't altogether love has reached the end of the road. It's a system that really has its origins in the second half of the 19th century in the science of that time, the medical science of that time, which was dedicated to treating the diseases of that time, which were mostly infectious. And that model is now really no longer appropriate. It's no longer fit for use. We have a terrible medical model. I'm going to talk about what its problems are and why we have to find a better way of helping to maintain public health. So I would say to all and sundry, including any doctor or clinical scientist present, and I will defend this proposition, that in terms of reactive models of healthcare, in terms of pharmacocentric models of healthcare, we've reached the end of a long and painful road. I'm going to quote the economist Herb Stein. Not every economist gets a law named after them. He's a 20th century American economist, and his law is very, very simple. He says if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And it was really applicable to the dire science of economics, but it's also true for economics and healthcare in general. And it's everything to do with cost, supply, and demand. And these are the reasons why the current healthcare system has reached the end of the road. So let's talk briefly about cost and demand. Now, the pharmaceutical industry is moving away as quickly as it can from small molecules to what are called biologicals. These are supposedly more precise, supposedly less toxic. In fact, that's not necessarily the case, but they're certainly more expensive. Average cost for this new type of drug, relatively new, is somewhere between $10,000 and $500,000 a year, and rising rapidly, rising more rapidly than inflation. So if you look at cancer drugs today, the new cancer drugs cost on average $250,000 a year. Who can afford that? And one of the most expensive of these biologicals, Zolgensma, which is an injection used to treat a form of neonatal spinal atrophy, muscular atrophy, is costed at $2.1 million per shot. Now, the good news is you only need one. The bad news is that for every child it saves, it kills another. So you roll the dice and take your chances. And at $2.1 million per shot, those are expensive, and I don't like those chances. So these drugs are very, very expensive indeed. Demand for them is increasing because of public health, which is in a continuous and very substantial phase of decline. And I'll show you very quickly a few slides. Some of you have seen this, a version of this presentation, but I fleshed it out. This is a Rand Corporation report And you can see here between 1995 and 2020, 2025 now, the numbers of people with chronic conditions in the United States increased from 118 to 164, projected to rise to 171 by 2030. Actually, for all kinds of reasons, we're going to overshoot that number. So this is a pretty negative picture. This is a condition known as NAFLD, which is now known as MASLD, metabolic dysfunction associated liver disease. And the reason why the liver is interesting is because it's the canary in the coal mine. When you ingest something, the first organ that it hits in high concentrations is, of course, it's the liver. And the liver is very good at regenerating itself. It's designed to be that way because it's often harmed by what we eat. And so it has to be able to be very good at repairing itself. It's second only to the epithelial cells in its terms of its ability to repair itself. But look at the numbers of people in whom even this very regeneration capable organ, the buffers have been overcome and people are moving into disease states. So in 1990, 1 in 5 approximately of the world's population was diagnosed with this condition. By 2020, it's 43%. By 2035 on current trends, it'll be over 1 in 2 in the entire world. And this is a devastating indictment of the toxic qualities of the modern diet. We can see a pattern if we look at USA National Health Service. And I will say that the USA is, in a sense, the bellwether of the global herd. It's going furthest and fastest down the Gadarene slope for reasons which I'll talk about in a minute. But every other country is following it in exactly this direction. So look at the situation with numbers of people with a single chronic condition. Between 2000 and 2020, they increased by a third. And in these same surveys, it was found that more than 40%, moving steadily towards half of all children now have a chronic condition, which can be anything from an allergy to an autoimmune disease to MASLD to even hypertension, migraines, a whole range of conditions that children now have, which they didn't a generation ago. Multiple chronic diseases between 2006 and 2010, a shorter period of time, but when you crunch the numbers, it's the same rate of increase. If we go back to 1960 and 1980, that's really my generation. In fact, I date back a little further than that. The numbers of children and adolescents who had a chronic condition at that time, 40%, more than 40%, it was only just over 4% in the period 1960 to 1980. So that gives you a clue as to how badly our public health has been affected. And if we go back to the very first USA National Health Survey, the numbers of adults with a chronic health condition, they're 60% today. They were 10% in 1935. So all of this is painting a picture of a population that is becoming very much sicker. It is in fact being chronically poisoned. Is it because we're getting older? That's something that some people say, was, we're living longer, so we have more chronic degenerative disease. No, absolutely not. If you look at the period between 1980 and 1990, life expectancy in that decade rose by 20 months. So that's the most rapid period of increasing life expectancy that we have seen. In that same decade, the prevalence of the major chronic diseases, and that includes type 2 diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and the cancers, rose by 40 to 150%, rising far more rapidly than the rate of increase in life expectancy. And this whole situation is made worse by demographics, because if you break the population down into working and those people who are not in the workforce, either because they're too young or because they're elderly and retired, and you can see that the percentage of the numbers of people who are in the population who are working and generating revenue is declining. So since approximately 2010, the numbers haven't changed very much, but look at the increase in the numbers of elderly. This is what they call the demographic time bomb, because it's the people who are working, who are putting money into Medicaid or other types of social insurance policies that are paid out to the elderly. It takes a lot of people working, paying taxes to maintain an elderly person who may have multiple illnesses and disabilities. And this model is now bankrupt. It's just run out of road. And some more demographics, older subjects are dying off, of course, but the numbers of people who are entering the high-risk zone are increasing much more rapidly. So the people in the over 65 group, and they tend to be increasingly people with multiple diseases. The numbers of people with multiple conditions are increasing dramatically too. And when they get to hospital, they're more difficult to manage, they're more expensive to manage. That group is increasing the fastest. So what's the latest data? Here we are in a situation where chronic diseases are the leading cause of disability and account for slightly more than 7 out of 10 deaths. About 20% of US GDP, and these diseases, the trends are all negative. They're occurring in younger subjects all over the world. So of course, life expectancy is falling. If the population is becoming sicker, health expectancy and then life expectancy must fall. And it's falling most rapidly in the United States and then the United Kingdom. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. So first, a little bit of detail here. And we need to ask the question, how did we get things so wrong? What kind of wrong turn did we make? When did it happen? What does it consist of? And what can we do to put it right? This is the money shot. This is a really, really interesting slide that I found when I was digging around in what used to be known as the Division of Vital Statistics at the National Center for Health Sciences. Is now that has been included into groups that have a rather different name today, like the NIH and the CDC. And if you look at the top two lines, the solid lines, what they are showing are the numbers of people dying from infectious and parasitic diseases, including bronchitis and tuberculosis. And you can see that from 1940 to 1960, they're falling consistently. They'd actually been falling for longer than that, since at least 1900, due to improved programs of public works, basically improved sanitation, water and air quality. The antibiotics made a little bit of a difference, not much. And the immunization programs made a little bit of a difference, but not much. Mostly the improvements in, or the reductions in these infectious diseases are to do with public schemes of sanitation. And the dotted lines represent chronic degenerative diseases, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer. And you can see that after about 1950, they really take off and they are taking over. They become far more important than the non-communicable diseases. Now, this is true for problems, health problems that affect the respiratory tract, but this is also true for problems that affect the gastrointestinal tract, the genitourinary tract, and it's a fairly general pattern. What's going on here? Well, in 1940s, that was when the diet really started to change, and we made a wholesale move away from basic produce to fast and ultra-processed foods. That's when the largest part of what's called the nutrition transition took place. And about 10 years after that, in and around 1950, that's when the chronic degenerative diseases really start to take off, because it turns out that this is a diet that poisons you. And it now accounts for 75% of all the calories that are consumed by consumers in North America, which includes not just the United States, but also Canada and Mexico. Along with this change in our eating habits, we have seen an increase in the frequency of many, many chronic degenerative conditions. And this is a general truth. These have all increased, but the latency has decreased. That is, we are seeing these emerging in younger and younger groups of patients. As you can see, this is an alphabetical list, and I'm not going to go into any one of them. I can give you a lecture on any one of them in detail, but this is a 30,000-foot view. We don't have time for that today. But there's a lot of problems going on here. And you can see it goes from A to E. This is just alphabetical order. So obviously there's a lot more, and I'm going to show you some of them. Here are the next group, from end-stage renal disease to lipedema, so from E to L, with a whole lot of psychological and psychiatric conditions mixed in there, including gender dysphoria, which is very fashionable at the moment. And here's a few more, and we're now going from N, from non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now, as I said, known as metabolic disorder, associated liver disease, through to trauma-induced brain damage. But actually, this is a short list. There's quite a few other conditions that I could have listed here. And all the while these things have been increasing, these things that we don't want, a number of things have been decreasing, including fertility, pancreatic muscle strength, which is seriously bad news, considering that about half of all young elderly adults, that is the group, let's say from about 50 to 65, almost a half of them now have either sarcopenia or pre-sarcopenia, which is now becoming a very significant cause of disability and death. We're losing impulse control, intelligence, resilience, testosterone. We're losing health expectancy, and therefore we're losing life expectancy. And it's interesting that the countries which are consuming the most of these ultra-processed foods, and that is the United States and the United Kingdom, they have shown the most precipitous declines. So I don't know if you can see the cursor moving on the screen, the dark blue, which comes down to the bottom of the graph at 2020, that's the United States. Trace it back to its origins. And in 1950, in terms of life expectancy rankings all over the world, the United States had 13th position. Now, life expectancy, average life expectancy, is a rather crude but reasonably meaningful way of measuring average national health. So back in 1950, the United States was among the 13 top healthy countries in the world. They're now 53. That was 2020, they have now fallen to 55. And then look at Britain. That is the pale blue curve here. If you look to the right, that's position 36. And Britain, back in 1950, was in position number 11. Brits were actually quite healthy, and look how much they have fallen. These are the countries that are consuming the most of these toxic ultra-processed foods. And this is where I want to make the key point that the medical model has been unable to cope with this. The last 50 years have seen an absolute explosion, a proliferation in the numbers of very specific, very potent, very expensive, and highly toxic pharmaceuticals that the medical profession used to try to treat everything. If this was really significant in terms of improving public health, then clearly public health would have improved as a result of all these pharmaceutical blockbusters. But as I've showed you, it hasn't. It's gone from bad to much, much worse. So drugs cannot fix this problem. They are not the solution. Just say no, as Nancy Reagan used to say. And this has really been proved by a couple of recent studies which looked at polygenic risk scoring via accumulated single nucleotide polymorphisms. And let me just explain what that means. What we're doing here is identifying as many risk-denoting genes as we can, and then in an individual, you add up all the risk-denoting genes, and if they've got 10, you assign them a risk score of 10. If they have 20, you give them a risk score of 20. And the idea is the more of these risk-denoting genes you have, the more likely you are to develop the condition. And the idea was, the pharmaceutical company's idea and the medical profession's idea was, well, if we could really get into the detail and identify who is most at risk in this way, we could then use pharmaceutical products, at least to reduce the risk in these people who are heading very seriously, as they thought, to a clinical endpoint. Now, you can't use pharmaceuticals in the general population, too expensive and way too toxic. But if you could identify the people who are really going to run into trouble, maybe you could justify treating them preventatively with drugs. 3 big studies, very big studies. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people now looking at these polygenic risk scores, and all 3 studies failed. They failed because even when you take all these risk factors into account, that does not predict who gets sick, because what does predict who gets sick is lifestyle, lifestyle, lifestyle. It's your exposure, the things in your life that you are exposed to, including those things that you eat. So in other words, this most detailed, most precise, most individualized way of trying to determine who was most at risk, who you could then treat with drugs, completely washed out. Insufficiently predictive to justify costs, and way too toxic. These drugs are way too dangerous to give to the general population. So let's go back to Stein's law. The medical model has failed. We cannot continue because we're seeing more chronic degenerative disease. More people are developing these illnesses early in life. And then by the time they get to old age, they are coming to hospital and tertiary and quaternary medical centers with multiple conditions, which are really difficult and very expensive and labor intensive to treat. We can't keep on doing that because, well, it has cost of healthcare. If you use this reactive model of healthcare, continue to increase, and the numbers of people in the workforce who are generating revenue are decreasing. Drugs are too toxic for prophylactic use, and we cannot predict who is going to get sick. These experiments have failed utterly. That was bad enough. But in the background, due to the stupidity, greed, and corruption of our political so-called elites, who are in most cases the scum of the earth, we are heading into a guaranteed long-term recession and depression. So even if we had a good economy, we couldn't keep this current reactive medical model going in the current situation that we are all in the West. This model is broken. It is bust. It cannot continue because we're being poisoned. And you've seen all this before. We're being poisoned by the ultra-processed diet, which creates chronic inflammatory stress, which creates dysbiosis, which reduces the functionality of our innate immune systems, and which leaves us vulnerable to glycemic stress and something called carbonylated stress, in oxidative stress, all of these things. And all of these things are absolutely caused by the modern ultra-processed diet. No wonder we're all getting sick. No wonder more than 40% of our children are sick. It's a shameful situation. And unfortunately, the reason why we haven't yet moved to a nutrition or food-based preventative model of healthcare is because the medical system is currently being held in check by the stakeholders, who are the pharmaceutical companies, to some extent, the medical professionals themselves, and I would say the health insurance companies. They can do nothing because we're being poisoned. We have to move on. We have to create a new model. Now that the old model is failing, now that the tree, the nest, have burnt to ashes, there is a real possibility for a phoenix to emerge from these ashes, a new medical system based not on drugs, but on nutrition, based not on the reactive system, waiting until people get sick, but stopping them from getting sick in the first place. And in order to do that, we have to analyze, how is the modern world, the modern diet, making you sick? How does the industrial diet kill you? Well, we know that it affects your metabolism. We know also that it affects your epigenome, and epigenetics is a fascinating topic. My mother was the head scientist in the world's very first university department of epigenetics, and so I was steeped in this from a very young age. But it really covers the way in which what we do, what we eat, affects the way in which our genome expresses itself, which genes are up and down regulated. And it turns out that the modern diet resets the epigenome in a way that is profoundly destructive, along with unbalancing our metabolism. So let's get more specific. How does the modern diet and lifestyle damage us? It causes, as I said, chronic inflammation, dysbiosis, type B malnutrition, and glycemic overload. These are four major drivers. There's other drivers as well, not quite so important, but perhaps we can talk about those on another occasion. All of this is made worse by our low energy lifestyle. We're physically extremely inactive, and that makes type B malnutrition and glycemic mismatch work. But for the first time ever, and this is what we're doing at Zinzuno, we can propose antidotes. And many of you have seen for yourselves that these antidotes actually work. And they are. To beat chronic inflammatory stress, well, you could take steroids or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, too toxic. Instead, we use a combination of the omega-3s and amphiphilic polyphenols, which is highly effective, does not cause atrial fibrillation, does not produce cytotoxic and arrhythmogenic breakdown products, unlike commercial fish oil. We can reverse dysbiosis, restore a pre-transitional microbiome using mixed fermentable carbohydrates. We can neutralize and alleviate type B malnutrition using a very broad spectrum micro and phytonutrient support program, which includes 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, so you're looking after the immune system. And to get over the worst of glycemic mismatch, firstly, I would tell people less sugar, less digestible carbs, more exercise. And any diabetologist listening will know that with this approach, you can cure type 2 diabetes. Other ways of doing it include taking AM kinase upregulators. The best known of these is metformin, which is actually a really interesting and drug which has recently been categorized as a gerosuppressant. But we know many other compounds which have exactly the same effect and have not yet been classified as drugs for those of you who would like to know more, if you visit my blog, in I think 2 weeks' time, I'm writing a post exactly on what these compounds are and how they work. So I'm going to stop the share at this point. And hopefully, Carla, there's enough time to throw it open for questions and maybe even some answers.
That would be also wonderful, Paul. Paul, it is actually really exciting just to see our future of what this is doing, because so many people, I mean, it just makes sense. A lot of people are trusting our medical professionals, whether it's because they're in this white jacket or why, but they're trusting them because we're kind of taught to trust them. And yet we also can see that even though we know more about health than we've ever known in the world has really never been more sick. So it's just not adding up, and there has to be other issues. So I really believe people are looking at other options, like what can be done. So we just need to get the word out about what Zinzino's doing. So I know, Paul, you have said that your passion is for making a dent in world health. What do you see Zinzino as being a part of that? I know that you know the founders, you know Doug, you know their vision also, and I think it aligns with what you're looking for. Paul?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, the pharmaceutical model, as I said, is really broken, badly broken. I think we will always require pharmaceutical pharmacology, but it should never have been placed front and foremost and in our treatment options. It's, I think one can contemplate a less centralized system where pharmaconutrition, test-based pharmaconutrition is made widely available. It becomes a little bit like, you know, the self-tuning systems you can build into cars. So you're monitoring performance, which you can do with our tests, and then you can rectify those metabolic imbalances before they progress to the point where you develop a clinical condition and overt clinical symptoms. Now, the pharmaceutical model, as I said, it's a reactive model. We wait till people get sick, then try to treat them, and it has done nothing for public health. We've been firing our magic bullets in the wrong direction. The enemy was elsewhere, and we were being attacked from the other side of the range by the food industry, who are now beginning to understand just how destructive that they have been. So that leaves us with nutrition. Now, the problem with nutrition is that it's a very large and very poorly controlled and I would say largely ineffective industry. The two largest sectors within supplements are fish oil and multivitamins and minerals. And we know that they don't work, but they've been tested repeatedly in multiple different ways. And the people like the Cochrane collaboration will say, no, all the evidence says fish oil doesn't work, multivitamins and minerals don't work. Why? Because they're so badly formulated. Frankly, because the people who formulated those products were still working with a kind of a pharmaceutical model in their minds. We've gone about things very, very differently. Instead of saying, oh, you don't have enough calcium, so let's give you more calcium, an approach which is one-dimensional, crudely linear, and completely ineffective. What we're saying is, well, how exactly, what are the mechanisms whereby the modern exposome makes us sick? Can we identify those mechanisms behind this curtain of thousands, tens of thousands of variables? And then if we can identify the drivers, can we neutralize them? That was our approach. And then we felt, okay, if we can do this, how can we demonstrate it? So now we're saying to people, okay, you don't have to go to the doctor. Hopefully you won't have to go to the hospital or the clinic or anything else. Test yourself if there is a problem. It may not yet have manifested overtly as a clinical condition, but if we can see this early on, there is a good chance that we will prevent you from ever reaching that clinical endpoint. Now, I think any doctor listening will agree that this is a better way to approach not just individual, but public health as well. We're using an approach which is extremely cheap compared to drugs. I mean, it's orders of magnitude less expensive. It is not toxic at all. I can say in all the years that I've been practicing this kind of medicine, I haven't killed a single patient. And I think very few doctors who use a pharmacocentric approach, a pharmaceutical approach, could actually make that claim. The medical profession kills a lot of its patients, not deliberately, generally, but simply because pharmaceuticals are pretty toxic tools. even when they're used reactively. Using them preventatively or prophylactically is simply not a place you can go. So what I'm talking about is a very major change in the way in which we think about healthcare. We're taking it away from a centralized and a vertical model whereby you go to the doctor and they will distribute pharmaceuticals, which will come to you from pharmacy. What we're saying is treat yourself, look after yourself. Don't ever get to the point where you're ever going to need primary, secondary, or tertiary medical services. Very decentralized, very disintermediating, very cheap, and just much more effective and much kinder. I think this is the way we have to go. And my point is, because the medical model we're currently still stuck with is failing now, it's only at the point of systems failure that one has a real opportunity to propose and develop a brand new model. And I think we're at that point right now. You know, people talk about the fourth turning. A lot of other social institutions are clearly no longer fit for purpose. The healthcare system is one of those. And we're proposing a new alternative and much more effective and much easier alternative to all of this. Test-based nutrition is the new medical model.
You know, and I was looking here, I can see that we have Mario Ruffalo on here, who is a doctor. He's an OBGYN. And as he said, so many people are looking at the westernized medicine. But when you're looking at Paul, you've also said our doctors don't know. There isn't, it should be a life science, but our doctors are being trained in pharmaceuticals. They're not being trained in what really could help them in keeping to the basics of what is needed in the body, correct?
Well, could I just say that I have a great deal of respect for the medical profession. And I don't mean to sound unduly critical of them. I think that it's a difficult training. They work long and hard and are by and large conscientious in caring for their patients. They don't have the right training. The majority don't. Now, increasingly, I am coming across doctors who have learned about and are learning about nutrition. I talk to a lot of them. I'm very happy to do that. And there are associations like, you know, A4M and equivalent groups like that in different parts of the world, where doctors who have been inside the medical system for a certain period of time and have come to recognize its weaknesses and its limitations are stepping outside that medical model to see what there is to offer from the wacky world of pharmaconutrition. And they're coming to us. And I'm really very happy to speak to them and to welcome them on board. The problem is that, you know, if you're an independent doctor or working perhaps in a small practice where you have a chance to talk to the other people and develop ideas with them and perhaps move things in a more interesting direction, that's fine. If you're working in a large healthcare association, your terms of reference are pretty strict. You will be working within a number of guidelines or algorithms which determine what and how you diagnose, and a corresponding set of algorithms which will determine and decide what treatments they use. And they are almost exclusively pharmaceutical. And the doctor who decides to kick over the traces and push against that and start talking a little bit about nutrition, that doctor is going to have a hard time. And I've spoken to quite a few who've started to move in this direction and who have been thrown out of their healthcare authorities because, and I quote, they were not generating enough revenue for the hospital or health group.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, who is it that is this American 20th century writer? The name escapes me. It will come back to me after the session is over. Who said it's hard to persuade a man of the truth if his livelihood depends on believing a lie. And I think I really do empathize with and I sympathize with those doctors who find themselves trapped in these kinds of working conditions, which make it very difficult for them to move towards us. But I can tell you, there's some interesting new developments. Do I have time to share them with you?
Absolutely. We're not going to take any time from you, Doctor. You get this floor. Go ahead.
What's really interesting to me is the Japanese Foshu market. Now, when the Foshu market first started, this goes back, I think, to the mid-90s, I think. Foshu means food for specific health use, and it was characterized by a proliferation of very small companies making really not very commercial products, which had physiological and possibly health benefits. And they tended to focus on things like prebiotic fiber and probiotics and things like that. And it was really tucked away in the corners of the market. No one paid it too much attention except for the health nuts. And then one day, a really big Japanese company called Ajinomoto launched a product into this Foshu category. I don't know why they did it. It must have been some, wild-eyed young executive who thought, right, let's do something really wacky and progressive. Who knows? Anyway, they did it. They launched this product, and almost overnight, the whole Foshu market changed. People now saw a major familiar household brand with a Foshu stamp on the package. And it rapidly changed the way in which people thought about food. So now the Foshu market is worth about 20 billion yen a year and rising. If you now launch a food into the Japanese market and it does not have Foshu or specific health use or claim attached to it, you probably won't do very well. So my point is the relationship between the Main Street consumer and food has changed. It's no longer just something that you use for fuel or pleasure. It's a part of your overall journey to health.
I love
So-
that. I love that.
Now it gets more interesting. I can tell you,
I just want to tell you what Susan wrote in there, because she said too, now the food in the grocery store, she can't get that what she wants. So now she's using Zinzino for her grocery store, along with some farmers markets. It kind of tied together with that. I needed to add that in from her. Go ahead, Paul.
well, that's sort of related. That I think that the point I wanted to make is, and I can't actually say who this is, okay? Because I'm contractually bound not to say this, but there is a very, 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 one of the world's largest retailers into the food space is now clearly starting a very substantial move into something like Foshu. In other words, and this is international. And the first company that does this, I think, is going to get a head start on every other company that is in the global food space, and it's at a significant level. And I think that it will work in the same way that we saw happening with Ajinomoto in the Japanese market. Once this has been established and mainstream customers and consumers now see, oh, here is a food that looks and tastes as good as anything I've eaten before, maybe better, then at this point, I think we're going to see a similar crystallization of public attitudes towards food that we saw in Japan. And I think this could be a real watershed moment. And once this company launches, and if that launch is successful, and I believe it will be, at that point, every other major player in the food space is going to have to jump on board for fear of being left behind. So I can see a somewhat better future emerging where the food environment, even the ultra-processed food environment, ultra-processed doesn't have to be bad. It's just the current generation of ultra-processed foods are. You can be ultra-processed and health positive. This is going to have a huge impact on public health statistics, as significant as was the impact of improved public sanitation on the frequency of the infectious diseases, which I referred to in that slide earlier. So I can see a very bright new landscape opening up. And at that point, I think the pharmaceutical industry will be forced to retrench very significantly. And I think that they will lose their current stranglehold on the models of reactive healthcare that we are still imprisoned by.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of has this, the truth will be told. And I think when the consumer starts to really look at things and find the truth, so that we're not just listening and following along to what is being sold to us or what the doctors are saying, but when we look and find the truth, we find Zinzino. I wanted to touch on these two questions here before. I know your time is going to be limited here. And it has to do with why it's
Absolutely,
Zinzino.
yes.
Why it is Zinzino that's gonna be making this difference. For example, I see it's, Robert Ferguson is saying, you know, a lot of fish oils are out there. People know omegas are great. And most of them are infused with a vitamin E. And so he's saying why is it that we're mixing this with polyphenols? And that's kind of our key of why this, I don't even call our product an omega-3 product or a fish oil, because it's a balanced product. It's making a difference. It's unlike things that are out there. Our health protocol is different. Nobody has a health protocol like Zinzino that's really making a difference. But let's start with that question, and then I've got another one here, but I'll let you answer that one first.
Well, could I just make a comment, because I've seen in the chat a contribution from Professor Joe Hibbeln, who's someone who I have a great deal of respect for. I think he's done absolutely sterling work in the area of omega-3s. And Joe, if I may call you Joe, thank you so much for joining. I hope that you found something of interest here. I think I'd be more interested to know if you found something, if you thought I said something that wasn't right. That's the only way that I can learn and grow my models. So anything that you have to say that is actually, that runs counter to my thinking would be greatly appreciated. But let me
And I'll just point
answer.
out on that too. Actually, Joe, this is what I've seen Dr. Paul thrive on when somebody has anything that they question. So Professor Joe, we would absolutely love to have any questions, or if you're able to ask any questions that you want to know that contradict Paul. I think, Paul, that's where you thrive the most. You like to be challenged, you like to be questioned, because you are also always focusing on the truth and where things are headed. So that's one reason we all love you. We're following you because we trust you. So let us know, Professor.
Well, no, but this is the essence. This is the scientific dialectic. We don't learn anything when people agree with us. It's at those points of disagreement, substantive disagreement, that we're forced to reconsider our model and start to examine where it might be wrong and how it might be improved, or at least extended. So why the polyphenols? What difference does that make? Well, back in 2015, I think I wrote the first academic paper on what I believed the significance of the polyphenols actually was. Now, this doesn't apply to all polyphenols, but it applies to those polyphenols which are associated with the omega-3s in the marine food webs. So it's, we had all this data that was creating acute cognitive dissonance, at least inside my head, because you had a lot of epidemiological data that said, well, eating fish, and probably particularly cold water oily fish, is actually really good for you. But then we had this raft of studies, apart from one or two really early studies, which we're getting into the weeds now. It's really interesting, but most of the studies with fish oil showed null or indeed in some cases negative effects, as we've seen recently with atrial fibrillation. So there clearly had to be a difference between oily fish and fish oil. And because I have worked for a number of pharmaceutical companies, and I was trained as a pharmaceutical pharmacologist, I was very aware of the bias that had been carried over, even into natural pharmacology, into thinking, well, there's this benefit, and it's got to be attributed to this compound. And so the original Danes, Bang and Duerberg, who did those studies with the Inuit, said, oh, it's all about the omega-3s. And as you've heard me say before, they were half right, but completely wrong. Because omega-3s clearly are important. I'm not saying that they're not at all. They're very, very important. But I don't think they work particularly well unless they are combined with these rather strange polyphenols that you find in the marine food web. And they're called, most of them are fluorotannins. And you have some which are more hydrophobic, some of which are more hydrophilic. But there's this very interesting group which are basically, they have a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic end. So they are amphiphiles, technically. And what that means is in the cold water marine algae, whether they're single cells or macroalgae that produce these omega-3s, they produce these fluorotannins as well, and they bind very, very tightly to the fish oil. They form kind of macroliposomes because of the structure of the fluorotannins. And so the omega-3s travel bound to the polyphenols through the gut and the tissues of the krill, and then the gut and the tissues of the pelagic fish, and then the gut and the tissues of the large fish, the marine mammals, and the Inuit. You never find the omega-3s on their own. They're too fragile. They can't travel in this way. But they are stabilized and they can survive for years if they're bound to the polyphenols. And you always find them together. Even if you cut into an Inuit, which I haven't personally done, but I've attended a surgery where someone from the northwest of Europe was being operated on. And the interesting thing is their adipose tissue is not the same color as the adipose tissue you'd find in an average Western person, which is either cream or maybe pale yellow, or if they've eaten a lot of beta carotene supplements or drunk a lot of carrot juice, it might be more orange. But the body fat in those people who are eating a lot of these oily fish is actually pale brown. And that is the same pigment that you find in the cold water seaweeds, and those are the fluorotannins. So they travel together. And we see the same thing in the dry blood spot tests that we've done. We're now up to about 1.5 million, which is the largest library by, I think, an order of magnitude in the world at the moment. And we find that, let's say in Europe, average 6-to-3 ratios are about 15-to-1. And that's in people who don't eat fish, don't take fish oil supplements. If they take a fish oil supplement, that brings it down to about 10-to-1, which is an improvement, but it's not enough. It's just not enough. You get good primary bioavailability. Anyone can absorb fish oil or oil of any kind of edible oil because there are evolutionary cogent reasons for that. You can't afford to waste such a dense source of calories. So it doesn't matter whether the oil is present as free fatty acids or esters or phosphatidyl phospholipids. We absorb that. So you have good primary bioavailability, but that's not what matters. The omega-3s in your bloodstream don't confer any anti-inflammatory effects. You need to incorporate them into your cell membranes before they can start to create an anti-inflammatory benefit. That's your secondary bioavailability. And then if we go back to our Europeans, 15-to-1 comes down to 10-to-1 if you take a commercial fish oil supplement, because most of the omega-3s are burnt up, they're oxidized, and they form some rather nasty cytotoxic and arrhythmogenic products, malondialdehyde, nonanols, compounds like that. And that's probably why, if you take a lot of commercial fish oil, you might increase your risk of atrial fibrillation. But in people who eat a lot of oily fish, and there are some in the northwest, again, of Europe, their 6-to-3 ratios dip down below 5-to-1, and they actually have a lower incidence of many of the inflammatory conditions. And the only other group that has this low ratio of 6-to-3 are the people who take balance oil, where the omega-3s have been recombined with amphiphilic polyphenols derived this time from olive. So it's all about biochemistry. It's about combinatorial biochemistry. It's about non-linear thinking, or at least non-pharmaceutical thinking. Nutrition is simply not conducive to magic bullets, to single actives, single outputs. That's a Pasteurian model. It works sort of for xenomolecules, for pharmaceutical molecules, but that is simply not how nutrition and how metabolomics work. In nutrition, everything is connected. Everything is joined up. Everything sort of bounces back and is very, self-reflexive and self-referencing. Again, I talk about this sort of thing a lot in my blog. And for anyone who's interested, here's the reference. Well, actually,
Yes, you
it's
can.
Dr. Paul
Thank you.
Clayton, EU.
Yes, Dr.
And
Clayton.
listen, if Professor Hilbun would like to comment, I'd be very happy to give him the mic.
I absolutely am. I did write him and ask that, and I just want to round this off also because as you were talking about our health protocol and how powerful things in with our getting into balance with our balance product, using our xenobiotic, which I know is one of the things you're most proud of, plus our vitamins and mineral, and how that really makes a difference. So I appreciate that. But yes, you mentioned Professor Joe Hibbelin on here, so I am going to have him unmute and join him here because you said you respect his work also. Dr. Paul, would you
Tremendously,
like to
tremendously.
introduce and let us know who Professor Joe is, because I just added him to our group. Paul, would you please introduce him?
Well, Joey, if we can get onto first name terms, I hope you don't mind, has a really an amazing track record. He has contributed so much to the research on omega-3s, particularly in the area, I think, of psychiatric medicine. But most interestingly, he also has a very distinguished military record and has combined both of these elements of his track so far in some really interesting papers, looking at, amongst other things, and Joe, you'll correct me if I'm misquoting you, looking at omega-3 levels in the brains of veterans who committed suicide. This was a paper that influenced me greatly in my thinking.
Now, I will say, I've had people be commenting, Dr. Paul, that, ooh, it can be hard to follow because it is so in-depth, you can really see. So Professor Joe, welcome to our Saturday call here. Appreciate you being on. And you had a lot of comments in here that were just incredible. So I thank you for actually unmuting and coming on. Hi.
Well, hello from South Lake Tahoe, California. Dr. Clayton, I really want to express my gratitude to you for letting me take a few moments of time and let me tell you personally, Paul, that I'm a great admirer of your work, and most clearly, as noted today, the compelling public health messaging of how the pollution of ultra-processed foods have wrecked our brains, our hearts, and most potently through our immune systems. And this is a fundamental and critical message to get through and get out. And it is a daunting task to change this in a meaningful public health manner. I just want to express my gratitude to you for your clarity and your eloquence in the presentations. The comments that I wanted to make and delivered in the comments section is that the critical actor here is also reducing the omega-6 fatty acids in the food supply, and that during the course of, and in the paper that I posted, during the course of all human and mammalian evolution, linoleic acid was about 1% of calories. And we looked at 837 different foods sold in the US from 1909 to 1999 and found that soybean oil, which didn't exist ever in human history and is the main contributor to ultra-processed foods, increased 1,000-fold in the course of the century, and has elevated the precursors, the 18 carbon fatty acid, omega-6 fatty acids, to huge levels that oxidize. The critical issue is that the plant sources the 18 carbon fatty acids, but the real actor in inflammation is the elongation, the arachidonic acid produced from soybean oil, because that is like pouring gasoline on the fire of inflammation. And a good Mediterranean membrane has about 50% arachidonic acid and 50% omega-3s and omega-6s, as well described by the Lanz equation. Bill Lanz really brought all of this forward. And so amongst the daunting tasks that we have is not only to add proper omega-3 fatty acids with polyphenols and good antioxidant measures as a product. But if we really want to make a public health impact, we have the daunting task of the battle of reducing linoleic acid and reducing soybean oils, as well described by Nina Techholz in her book, Big Fat Surprise, that there's a sort of an intellectual conspiracy out there that polyunsaturates, especially linoleic acid, lower cholesterol and therefore lower cardiovascular health. And it's just simply not true. So in addition to adding the omega-3s to bring the membranes back to Mediterranean levels, there is clearly a huge public health role and a public health service in lowering the linoleic acid, the primary inflammatory component of foods, so that we can restore, reduce violence, reduce depression, and keep our brains from being inflamed. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Joe. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that if we had time, we might get into a discussion on the impact of these plant oils on mitochondrial function or dysfunction. I think that's a point worth making. But there's other fatty acids really that one has to consider. What I've presented today is a bit of a simplified version. The odd chain dietary fatty acids are interesting collectively. And the C15s, the margaric acid, all of these are clearly potentially physiologically important and certainly worth looking at. Skiadonic acid is another. And all of these seem to have overlapping but slightly different anti-inflammatory effects. And at a certain point, what may happen is that this product that we have at the moment may become slightly more extended, a little bit more adventurous, and start to include some of those as well. But again, thank you so much for your comments, and it's such a privilege to have you in on this call.
Absolutely.
You're
And actually, now that I have you both here, and you know, one of the things that we see when we have scientists from that didn't know each other that work in the field, and you guys are finding out, because when you're looking for the truth, all roads lead to Rome, and we're finding these things. But now for us that are following you, we don't, you know, like people were saying, it was going over their heads. We don't all have those kind of brains that you two both do. But we want to get the word out of what Zinzino is really doing to make the difference. But it's health-based and science-backed, using the science that you guys have been studying. So what can we be doing to really make that impact? Besides getting out and talking one person to the next person to the next person, what else can we be doing?
I think as Joe implied, medicine and health do not occur in a vacuum. They are culturally and politically embedded, and there's enormous financial interests that have a stake in all of this. So it's not simply a question of us saying, well, look, here's the truth. This is the simplest thing you have to do. I mean, the governments in the West pay at least lip service to the idea of trying to educate people about better nutrition. But if you look at the amount of money they invest in those types of programs, they are absolutely dwarfed. They're just a percent or two of the advertising costs that are incurred by the food industry that is drowning us in these overwhelmingly chronically toxic foods. Elizabeth Chan was the former director of the WHO, and she actually knew something about health. Her background was in public health. She was based in Hong Kong, a wonderful person. And about 8 or 9 years ago now, she held a meeting of the WHO in Geneva, to which were invited representatives from all of the major international food companies. And she told them, the evidence is now overwhelming that your products are contributing to worsening public health and imposing a huge burden, financial burden, on our communities. If you don't mend your ways, we're going to put health warnings on your food in the same way that we've done with cigarettes. And so, of course, you know, within a year, she was gone. because the collective lobbying power of the food companies were more than enough to sweep her out of office. And she was replaced by the current incumbent, a man who claims to be a doctor, but whose doctorate is actually in theology from a third-rate university, and who has an unenviable history, which I urge you to go out and look for yourselves. And under or in association with his place at the helm, the WHO has taken, I believe, a very wrong and dark direction indeed. But it used to be a wonderful organization. My point is that our voices are very small. We can't compete with the very large companies which control so much of the food space, who have created a regulatory environment which actually makes it impossible for us to speak openly about the health associated benefits of nutrition and of foods in general. If we were to say,
Not only that, Paul, but we have people to say, well, our doctor says to stop this, or, I'll just listen to the doctor, and they're being, and they call us the ones that are brainwashed.
Well, look, as I said, I don't blame the doctors. They go through a type of medical training, which I went through myself. And by the time I came out of medical school, I too thought there was a pill for every illness, what I was taught. And it took me a long time to fall gradually from grace, and get to the point where I am now. But I think that, as I said, even although we can't talk very openly, we can't say, for example, that our products cure essential hypertension, even although they do. But we can't say that because that hits a regulatory tripwire. You can only say you can treat a medical condition if you have a pharmaceutically licensed product. So we cannot tell the truth. We have to use a kind of samizdat approach, which means, single typewritten sheets you can paste on the signs of abandoned buildings, as they used to do in the Soviet Union. And we can talk to each other. We can talk to friends and family members in very small environments where we don't think there's a representative from the FDA or EFSA or the TGA present. And we can speak openly to each other at least. And that's what's going on. And it's behind the spread of the things that we're doing. And that's great. We're now in over 140 countries. But the real impact, to be very frank, is not going to be made by us. The big change in public health and in people's attitudes towards food, I think that's going to be made by the first of the very major food companies that announces this sea change and produces a generation of functional foods which are cheap, which are convenient, which have a long shelf life, a high profit margin per square foot of shelf space, and are addictive, or as near as damn it to being addictive, but are health positive. And that is now perfectly possible. So that's going to be a very interesting second generation of ultra processed foods. And I think that is what's going to make the real difference at the global level. We can still go on what we're doing. It's important that we do. We can reach a lot of people, but we're I hesitate to go all biblical, but we're just John the Baptist. I think that it's going to be the big players that are going to make that are going to change the rest of the world.
Okay, well, thank you both, actually. Thank you, Professor Joe, for jumping on too. But for the rest of us, we are excited about the future and where we're going with this, because we're following people like you both who are leading the way with the science so that we can get the word out to the rest of the world about what Zinzino is here to do and really make a difference in world health and prove it. So test-based nutrition, the only future of the only way of going forward in our future of healthcare. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Joe. Thank you, Dr. Paul. We appreciate all the work you do. We follow you, and we're grateful for everything that you do. So thank you. Thank you both for joining. And I'm going to unmute everybody so they can also say thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul, Professor Joe, thank you
Thank
very much.
you.
Very much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you from Scotland.
Thanks,
I can put it on.
Thank you.
from London.
Thank you from the
Thank you,
US,
Dr. Clayton.
New York.
And thank you for this presentation.
Thank you from Canada.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job, Carla.
Thank you.
Great job, Carla. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great Saturday. We'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joe. Thanks.